I've always had a strange notion that anybody who's severely depressed should actually make a documentary about themselves and their life, as if it was from a third person and as if they had passed, to see all the gifts that they have in their life and their traits. And you definitely see that when you watch the film, and it is beautiful and at the same time sad, in that you also look at your own life and say, wow, I've taken so much for granted. What would you recommend to another family, another person who, whatever the subject is, having someone come into their life and filming intimate moments and things that are quite devastating to most people? What would you tell them? How would they prepare themselves, and how did you approach it?
I think when people watch the film for the first time, they don't realise, or what you don't see is that Neil and I lost our privacy a long time before the camera actually arrived in the house. And, you know, it was very hard for us to stay as our little unit of three, and we'd only just become that little unit of three, so we tried very hard to try and cope on our own as long as possible. But I think that perhaps we could have asked for help a wee bit earlier. But once that help did start flowing and started coming through the door, at that point, I think that's when you feel that you're losing your privacy. And in a way, having the camera there for Neil clawed back a little bit of that privacy for him. He was so physically dependent on everybody around him that you know, I was never very far from hovering at the door in case he was choking, or you know, he needed any physical help in some way, or anything happened with his ventilator that only I knew how to solve for him. So it was very good. He rarely experienced a closed door, but when Emma came down with the camera and just let him speak. I mean, you were in the room with him and you were asking him questions, and I wasn't far from hovering from the door. But I think because it was Emma asking the questions, and Morag a little bit as well, I think she was, but I think when it was just you and Neil, I think because you didn't know each other as well as Morag and Neil, then that's when he began to really feel a bit of release, actually. He knew that he was saying things that would be recorded and that he could, you know, pass on to Oscar, and I think he really benefited from it. He really benefited from that emotional release. I certainly, you know, there was certainly a kind of calm in the house when you left, I think. Yeah.
I remember one time arriving and you saying to Morag and myself, "Thank goodness you've come, he's got so much to say." And you were like, "Just go." And he was really waiting to speak, and you felt that this had been building up like a dam and it needed expression. And in a way, I mean, it is incredible that a man who couldn't move from the neck down is still communicating with people all over the world through this film and through his determination to reach out. And I think it was in those moments that that incredible urge would express itself. But maybe it's also a wee bit, he knew, as he said in the film, that he only had this one freedom, which was the freedom to communicate. And that was a devastating discussion that we had when Morag and I in advance had decided that we had to ask this really difficult question of what do you miss most? And it did feel very, you know, a very hard thing to ask him. And he went through every part of his body saying what he missed. He talked about, you know, what he missed doing with his feet, what he missed doing with his legs, how he missed hugging his friends because he was a hugger.
He really was.
And then he talked about, and this really, I think, you know, certainly affected us a lot at the time, when he said the thing that he really missed was just pushing his child in a pushchair. And that felt like, how simple could you get? Just missing pushing your child in a pushchair. And I think being able to be as specific as that with each thing allows us as an audience to enter that experience of loss of movement, of loss of who he was. So then the question comes, well, who are we as human beings? And when does our humanity go? And I think these were the questions that Neil was asking of his life, is how long could he keep hold of his humanity? And I think actually towards the end, a much bigger humanity came out. Certainly for me, and more like looking at him anyway, it felt like something quite immense and incredible came from his suffering, and from his desire not to just treat it as suffering as an end in itself, but to think what he could learn to share with other people. And that's when it wasn't just about ALS or MND, but about, as you said, about time, and about realising that he had something to say about an awareness of life.